Hello everyone, welcome to our Chapter 10 discussion regarding consideration. Now we're still talking about contracts, but in this instance we're talking about consideration. Let's take a look at what we've discussed so far. We've talked about an agreement, which is an offer and an acceptance. Now we're going to talk about consideration. Later we're going to talk about contractual capacity and legal object. So these are all elements of a contract. So consideration. The book in this chapter uses rules, and I like that. So let's look at this first rule. Consideration is what a person will receive in return for performing an obligation. Each party must receive something in order for there to be a contract. There has to be consideration, something flowing back and forth between the two parties. So in this example, and this is an example from the book, Mary is selling a car to Dan. So selling the car to Dan, the car itself is consideration flowing to Dan. Something of value is flowing to Dan. Now what is Dan doing? Dan is paying for the car, so that money is consideration flowing back to Mary. Again, there has to be both. There has to be something of value flowing between the two parties. Again, in this instance, in the purchase of a vehicle, the sale of the car itself is consideration flowing to Dan, and the purchase amount is consideration flowing back to Mary. Now, we said something of value. It doesn't always have to be money. And I like this example from your book. This is the case of Hamer versus Sidwell. And in this instance, William E. Story is the uncle, and the nephew is William E. Story II. Well, the uncle must be concerned about how the nephew is spending his life. And so he decides to pay him $5,000 in exchange for the nephew not drinking, smoking, swearing, playing pool or cards for money until the age of 21. So they enter into an agreement. Again, uncle says, I'll pay you $5,000 if you don't do these things, and the nephew agrees. Well, the uncle dies before the payment can be made, and the nephew's representative sues the estate. And the estate argues that, well, there's no consideration. What did the nephew give up? What value was flowing back to the uncle? But here the court ruled in favor of the nephew's representative. The court ruled that the act of giving up something by the nephew in and of itself was consideration. Okay? Made no difference that there was no benefit to the uncle, at least no monetary benefit. What was important here is that the nephew gave something of value. He had the right to do these things. He gave up the right to do these things in exchange for $5,000. And here the court said that's consideration. Now, interesting, the book adds a little twist to this, and I think it's a good question. What would happen if the nephew was not of legal age? Okay, he was not permitted to do these things anyway. We're going to see this later. Well, that would not have been consideration because he wasn't giving up anything. Okay, think about it. What was he giving up? Nothing, because he wasn't allowed to do those things anyway. But here he is giving up something. Okay, that's consideration. So it doesn't always have to be a dollar amount like our purchasing a car example. It can be giving up something. So there's something of value flowing back and forth between the parties. In this instance, $5,000 from uncle to nephew, and nephew to uncle, forbearance. The next rule. For a promise to be enforced by the courts, there must be consideration. So we've been talking about that. But I was thinking, well, what about a unilateral contract? Remember, a bilateral contract is a promise for a promise. A unilateral contract is a promise for an act. So I think I used the example before that if I lost my dog and I put up a sign that says $100 for the safe return of my dog, and you returned my dog, found him and brought him to me, that would be a unilateral contract. I promise to pay in exchange for a future act. Well, there is consideration there, okay? The consideration is me promising to pay the $100, and the act is you bringing the dog to me, okay? Consideration, okay? The $100 was consideration on my part, and you taking your time, finding my dog, bringing the dog to me was the consideration flowing back to me. So in both of these instances, in a bilateral contract, promise for promise, and unilateral contract, promise for an act, there must be consideration, and there can be consideration. So let's talk about this concept called promissory estoppel. And here's one of those situations where we're entering the realm of sort of strange legal principles that are somewhat difficult to understand. Promissory estoppel is and this comes from the book, the legal enforcement of an otherwise unenforceable contract due to a party's detrimental reliance on the contract. So here we have a contract that may in all respects be unenforceable, but the law is going to enforce it because one party detrimentally relied on it. They relied on the contract to their detriment. Okay, sort of a fairness issue here. We're sort of stepping outside of the realms of that classic consideration. So here we're interested in three conditions, and these are laid out in the book. One party makes a promise knowing that the other party will rely on it. The other party does rely on the promise. And then the only way to avoid injustice is to enforce the promise. I think an example will help us understand this principle. There's a case called AA Builders Limited versus Grand State Construction LLC. This is a case out of Arizona dating back to 2005. And in this case, AA was a general contractor, and it was asking for bids from subcontractors for the construction of a Home Depot facility. Well, Grand State submitted a bid. The condition of the bid was that they were going to hold their price open for 30 days. Okay, so Grand States submits a bid to AA. Grand States says they'll hold that bid open for 30 days. Well, AA, the general contractor, loved that bid, used that bid, and got the job. Well, AA then sent a subcontract to Grand States, and Grand States declined to sign it. Okay, Grand States said, upon reviewing your schedule, let me just go to the slide for that. So Grand State said, upon reviewing your schedule for this upcoming project and our own inventory of presently scheduled work, we will not be able to enter into a contract with your company. From the time we received the contract from your office, we signed 4 other contracts that were bid around the same time. So Grand State said, we can't do this anymore. But this was still within the 30-day window. Well, how did the court rule? The court ruled as follows. Subcontractor submitted a bid stating our price is good for 30 days. Okay, we've talked about that. This statement constituted a promise to perform at the stated price. Subcontractor admitted that it realized that if its bid was the lowest, general contractor might rely on the bid in preparing its overall project price. General contractor did in fact rely on this bid by incorporating it into its own proposal. Reviewing the evidence in the light most favorable to upholding the decision of the trial court, we find that substantial evidence in the record supports the trial court's application of promissory estoppel to allow general contractor to recover damages for subcontractors' refusal to perform on its bid. So here the court ruled in favor of the general contractor, AA. Now, they didn't make Grand States honor the contract, but they awarded AA damages because Grand States had pulled out of the deal. Why? Because the AA, the general contractor, had relied to its detriment on the bids submitted by Grand States. Promissory estoppel. Here's another rule. The court seldom considers adequacy of consideration. So remember, we talked about there has to be consideration flowing back and forth. Doesn't always have to be money. Doesn't have to be something that we normally think holds value, like we saw in that Hamer case of forbearance. But here, this rule is talking about the court just doesn't care about the adequacy of consideration. In other words, you have the freedom to make a bad deal. You might have purchased a car, and after you got home, you realized, wow, I paid way too much for that car. And unless you were defrauded, the court does, so the law does care about being defrauded, but the court doesn't care whether you made a bad deal, whether you paid too much, okay? The court seldom considers adequacy of consideration. Another rule, an illusory promise is not consideration. An illusory promise is not consideration. So here's an example. I say, I'll sell you my rotting lawnmower to you for $500. And then you respond by saying, I'll come over tomorrow and take a look at it. And if I like it, it's a deal. This is from the book, the definition, illusory promise, a situation in which a party appears to commit to something, but really has not committed to anything. It's not a promise and thus not consideration. So, is this a promise for a promise? Is there consideration flowing back and forth? There is kind of a promise for a promise. I'll sell you the riding lawnmower, and you promise I'll come over tomorrow and take a look at it. But there's not consideration. That is an illusory promise. You didn't really promise to do anything except come over. There was no consideration. Here's another rule. Past consideration is no consideration at all. Past consideration is no consideration at all. So I say, because you've been getting to work on time in the last 2 weeks, I'm going to give you a $200 bonus at the end of the year. I so appreciate the fact you've been getting to work on time. That's great. When the end of the year comes around, I'm going to give you $200, and I forget about it. I don't give you that bonus. Can you sue me? Well, you might be able to sue me, but you're probably not going to be able to recover anything. There's no consideration here because the promise to give the bonus was in exchange for past performance. What was your past performance? Getting to work on time for that 2-week period. Okay? Past consideration, what you've already done, is no consideration at all. Next rule. A promise to do something that you are already obligated to do is not valid consideration. A promise to do something that you are already obligated to do is not valid consideration. So here's an example that the book gives. There's a crime committed. You approach a police officer and say, I'll give you $1,000 if you go apprehend that person. Well, the police officer already has an obligation to do that, okay? So that is not valid consideration. Your consideration to him is the $1,000. His consideration to you is to do something that he already has a legal obligation to do, okay? That is not consideration, right? So here we're still talking about that same rule. A promise to do something that you're already obligated to do is not valid consideration. But here we're talking about, this is a quote from the book, performance of an existing contractual duty is not good consideration. Here's an example. You say, I'll paint your car for $5,000 and have it completed by June 1st. I said, sounds good, agreed. You later say, I can't get it done by June 1st, but if you give me another $1,000, I can get it done on time. It feels like a little bit I'm being cheated there, but I say, okay. But I am not obligated to pay that extra money because you had a pre-existing duty to finish the job by June 1st. Okay, there's no consideration for that extra amount of money. You already had a duty to do that. Okay, you promised to do something that you were already obligated to do is not valid consideration. Now, here's some exceptions to that pre-existing duty rule. One of them is unforeseen circumstances, and the book uses building a swimming pool as an example. Your contractor is building a pool. He contracts with you to build that pool for a certain price, but at some point he comes to you and says, I need $5,000 more, and you say, okay. Well, is it enforceable? Well, the book uses an example that if he encountered rock in the excavation, and he had not encountered rock in similar locations before, and so that was an unforeseen circumstance. So encountering that unforeseen circumstance makes that contract enforceable. Okay, that's an exception to the pre-existing duty rule. Okay, unforeseen circumstances. Additional work is another example. Again, if he says to complete the pool, I need $5,000 more, but I'll also install a pool deck and a waterfall. Well, that additional work provides the consideration for that extra $5,000. So exceptions to the pre-existing duty rule, encountering unforeseen circumstances, and doing additional work. I think both of those are mutually exclusive. So it could be unforeseen circumstances or doing additional work. Both of those are examples. Let's talk about partial payment of debt. And here we're using terms liquidated and unliquidated, which seems a little strange phrase, counterintuitive, but let's define our terms. Liquidated debt, you're certain you owe the money as well as how much you owe. Okay, I get a credit card debt statement every month. I look at that statement, I see how much I owe, I know how much I owe, and I know that I owe it. Okay, an unliquidated debt is I don't think I owe you money, but if I do, I don't owe you what you think I owe you. Okay, so you're not only disputing, you're either disputing that you owe the money, or if you do owe the money, you're disputing how much you owe. Okay, so let's move on with those, having understood those definitions. So, bank agrees to accept less than you owe on your undisputed credit card debt. Here the debt is liquidated. Okay, they say we'll accept less than what you owe. You know the amount you owe, you know that you owe it, but you decide, you enter an agreement with them that you'll pay less. But so if they come to you later, you still have to pay the original amount because the debt is liquid. Now, a creditor's promise to accept less than owed when the debtor is already obligated to pay the full amount is not binding. That's a quote from the book. Let's read that again. A creditor's promise, so in this instance the bank, a creditor's promise to accept less than owed when the debtor is already obligated to pay the full amount is not binding. Let's talk about this idea of accord and satisfaction. Accord and satisfaction. Here's the rule. An accord and satisfaction is an arrangement between contracting parties whereby one of the parties substitutes a different performance for his or her original duty under the contract. Let's read it again. An accord and satisfaction is an arrangement between contracting parties, two parties getting together to contract, whereby one of the parties substitutes a different performance for his or her original duty. Okay, so the accord is the promise to perform the different performance, and the satisfaction is the performance of the different performance. And the book lays out 3 requirements. The debt is unliquidated. In other words, the amount or existence of the debt is in dispute. The creditor agrees to accept as full payment less than the creditor claim is owed, and then the debtor pays the amount they have agreed on. Let's take a look at an example. This is an example from the citation I'm giving at the bottom of the page there. So in this example, a hotel wants to hire a plumber for a huge project. The project is worth $50,000 total. The hotel agrees to pay $20,000 down, $15,000 as an interim payment, and then $15,000 as a final payment. Well, when the job is finished, the hotel is just not satisfied, and they withhold the final payment. But you can agree to an accord and satisfaction. The hotel, instead of paying the $15,000, agrees to pay $5,000. And what are they doing by doing that? They're giving up the right to sue you for your not finishing the job. The contractor, by accepting the $5,000, is giving up the $10,000. And what do they get? They also avoid a lawsuit. So there is accord and satisfaction. Well, that wraps up our discussion regarding consideration. Thank you for your attention, and we'll see you next time.